Hey everyone, just doing a quick recording for you here on muscles and what goes on with the muscles. So we'll get started with that. So this is concept D4 in your concept checklist. Your objectives for this section really are going to focus in on this first bullet here. Not going to spend too much time talking about these and not going to make you super responsible for what goes on with actin and myosin, more just an awareness that they exist. Um, but you really are going to have to be able to link the muscles that we're talking about, at least in the digestive and respiratory systems. But also, we're going to talk about a big muscle in the circulatory system and maybe some in the excretory system. And locomotory system, that's the system of muscles that help you move. And we'll talk a little bit about those as well. So, there's three kinds of muscles that we find in our bodies, but our bodies contain over 600 muscles. And to help you feel a little more relaxed about this, you don't have to know all 600 muscles for this course. But what you do need to know is some examples of certain types of these three kind of muscles: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. And what we have down at the bottom here are just a couple of diagrams sort of showing the um, microscope slides of what these three kinds of muscles would look like. Um, Up over here in the top right, this is just an illustration of some of the skeletal muscles that you might encounter in the bodies. You know, everything from the biceps muscle, which is located here on the arm, to your deltoid muscles, which are on the outside, to your pecs or pectoral muscles over here, all the way down into your quadriceps muscles that you have in your legs. So these are examples of skeletal muscles here, and then these are what the kinds of muscles would look like. So cardiac muscles are associated with the heart, but in many ways they resemble skeletal muscles, meaning that, you know, if you're given a microscope slide of them side by side, they might look very, very similar. But the cardiac muscles are all about making the heart beat. And so while we haven't talked about the heart just yet, we will be talking about the heart in the next week and trying to understand that. And so it's these cardiac muscles that help the heart beat, but they do so without the use of the skeleton, which our skeletal muscles use. The other interesting thing that's different between cardiac muscles and skeletal muscles is that they contract and relax involuntary, and they're controlled by the medulla oblongata in the brain. And right now, I bet if everybody looks over at Sophia, I just said medulla oblongata, and she's probably smiling at this point. Sorry, Sophia. So involuntary, that part of the brain, the hindbrain, really controls a lot of our automatic stuff in our bodies. So we don't have a lot of control over what goes on with the heart muscle. It just beats and takes care of itself. Smooth muscle. We find smooth muscle all over the body as well, and these are found in our internal organs. So things like the linings of the stomach, we talked about the muscles in the stomach, the esophagus, the muscle that pushes the food down through peristalsis, is a smooth muscle. The muscles in the walls of the uterus that are used to give birth to a child are also smooth muscles. They also make up the sphincters in our digestive system. So the lower esophageal, the pyloric, and the anus are all sphincters, and they're all smooth muscle. They also will contract involuntarily, meaning that we don't really have control over it. We don't think about, oh, I need to open my lower esophageal sphincter so food can get down into my stomach. It just happens automatically. What's interesting to notice when you look at the difference between the cardiac muscles and the smooth muscles is that these do appear under an electron microscope, or under the microscope we're using here, to be a little smoother. And you'll notice kind of the rough texture of the muscles in the cardiac muscles and in the skeletal muscles that we're seeing under an electron microscope here. So that's another distinction between them. So the last type of muscle you need to know are skeletal muscles, and these ones appropriately are attached to bones. Muscles attached to bones via tendons, and just for argument's sake, when we're attaching bone to bone, it's done through a ligament. So if you damage a ligament, that's an attachment between two bones. When you damage a tendon, that's what's holding a muscle onto the bone itself. So skeletal muscles attach to tendons to the skeleton, and these muscles are run along the lengths of our bones, aiding us with maintaining posture and moving. Tendons are just a type of connective tissue, so they're not really a muscle at all. They're just a type of connective tissue. Skeletal muscles, here's one of your differences between the other two, is that they're voluntary muscles. You choose when you bend your arm. You choose when you move your mouth. And that's all done through conscious thought, whereas the other two are controlled automatically by certain parts of our brain without us thinking. In general, it's important to note too that the average adult male has about 42% of their body mass made up by skeletal muscles, whereas females are about 36%. But I always say that's average. It could be very different from person to person. So those are your three kinds of muscles. Now, what I want to do is just take a second to introduce you to some terminology that we use when we're talking about muscles. So we've talked about this already because we explored a muscle already, the diaphragm, and I used terms like contract and relax. When muscles shorten, they contract, and when they lengthen, they react. And so I found this this website here. I'll drag onto the screen that sort of shows what we're talking about, and I'll see if I can make that in. So there's a skeletal muscle right there. One of your biceps muscle, and you can see that as the animation goes forward, this is the relaxed version of the muscle, and now it's contracting. Okay, and you can see how the muscle gets longer in its relaxed form, and it gets shorter in its contracted form. The other thing, I'll try to zoom in here. Hang on. There we go. This down here is a tendon. Okay, notice how it's attaching to one of the bones in the lower arm. And then we've got a couple of other tendons up at the top here that are attaching the biceps muscle to the scapula, as well as to the top part of the humerus, which is your upper arm bone. So I thought that was kind of interesting that we can sort of see the animation of the muscle contracting and relaxing, and then I was able to show you the attachment points, the tendons that we have going on. In many parts of our body, we also have what are called antagonistic muscles. So these are a pair of muscles, skeletal muscles, that work against each other to make a joint move. So when you think of your arm, and I'll drag this one back in here, when you think of your arm, what you're seeing here is actually they're missing a muscle, an antagonistic muscle. We're seeing the biceps do their job, but there's another muscle back on the underside of the arm, on the back side of the arm, called the triceps muscle, that actually is antagonistic. And so when the arm is straightening, like it is now, we are using the triceps muscle to straighten it, and that is opposed by the biceps muscle, which curls your arm up and bends the joint. So these two work together to bend the actual joint that we're working on. So that's what we call an antagonistic pair of muscles. That in that antagonistic pair that bends a joint, so your biceps and your triceps, or maybe your hamstrings and your hamstring and your quadriceps muscles. Quadriceps are on the front part of your legs, hamstrings are on the back part of your legs. Those muscles are antagonistic, and each antagonistic pair has a flexor and an extensor. The flexor is the muscle that contracts to bend the joint, so to actually turn your arm from straight into, let's say, 90 degrees. And so that would be your bicep that's doing that. And then your extensor muscle is the muscle that contracts, and when it contracts, it straightens the joint, so your arm extends straight out. So that's your tricep muscle. So you're seeing the triceps are on the back here, and the biceps are on the front here. So this is your flexor muscle, and this is your extensor muscle. And then all of these other things that are labeled on here, humerus, radius, ulna, those are the bones in your arm. And then you can see they've also labeled on here the tendons that attach. So you can see there's a couple of tendons up here for the top of the biceps, a couple of tendons up here for the top of the triceps. Notice how the tendon wraps around underneath and to straighten when it attaches to the ulna. So it's kind of interesting. So flexors and extensors, antagonistic, contract, relax, those are all terms that we use to describe muscles. Skeletal muscles in your body also help to keep you warm. Interestingly enough, about 80% of the energy used in a skeletal muscle is lost as heat. And that's just due to the sheer amount of friction that is created when these muscles are actually doing their job. And so it's also neat to think about shivering. When we shiver, that is a reaction to us being too cold. And we'll talk more about shivering when we get into talking about the circulatory system. But when we start to shiver, that's a rapid contraction of certain muscles, usually around the core of our body, in our chest and our abdomen. And those rapid contractions are generating a whole lot of wasted heat, which will help to warm us up. Maybe if you've got a second, you guys want to talk about this, think about what else you could do to warm yourself up and explain why you would do it and how this would work. So you could pause if you'd like right now. Or choose not to pause. Whatever you'd like. So last thing I want you guys to understand on here, and this is about the level of detail, the smallest level of detail I think I'm going to hold you guys responsible for, is talking about how a skeletal muscle is actually organized, what it looks like if we were to take a cross section of it. And that's what this diagram on the right is showing. A skeletal muscle is made up of bundles of muscle fibers. So each one of these little cases here is a bundle of muscle fibers. So there's several bundles of them here. And in each one of these bundles is an actual, so there's several bundles of muscle fibers on this here. And then if we zoom one of them out, one of these things is considered to be a muscle fiber. And then those muscle fibers are made up of myofilaments. And these myofilaments are arrangements of muscle cells lined up end to end. And what happens is those myofilaments can shorten and lengthen as we are contracting and relaxing our muscles. So at some point I'd like you guys to be able to reproduce a diagram like this or interpret a diagram like this, saying that there are bundles of muscle fibers in one big skeletal muscle, and that bundle is made up of a whole bunch of little myofilaments. Now this sarcolemma, don't get too much caught up on it. It's just a surrounding, a casing for those myofilaments to protect them and nourish them in some ways. So skeletal muscles are cylindrical muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber contains hundreds of parallel cylindrical myofilaments. And these myofilaments contain contractile proteins that help that muscle to contract, and they are called actin and myosin. That's as far as I want you guys to know. Just know that actin and myosin are essential for driving muscle contraction. That's it. That's what I need to know, is that these skeletal muscles are arranged into bundles of these muscle fibers, and a muscle fiber bundle contains a bunch of myofilaments that are stacked together, and they're basically specialized cells that are designed to contract and relax, and it's all aided by these special proteins called actin and myosin. At this point, you have a couple more sections in your notes that are showing how the actin and myosin work. I don't want you to know this. It's it's tricky, and far beyond where I need you to be at this point. Needless to say, there's sort of two parts to this. We've got a myosin in here and an actin filament on the outside. And what happens is this gap here ends up shortening and relaxing, shortening and widening, depending if we're trying to contract or relax the muscle. That's as far as I want you to go with that. So what I'll get you to do, if you guys would like, is to have a look at these questions on page 304 to wrap up this concept. Don't forget you got a quiz tomorrow on D3 and D4, but I'll start the quiz 15 or 20 minutes into class, just in case you guys have any last minute questions on the respiratory system or muscles. Remember, for muscles, it's going to be very straightforward, right? I need to know the three kinds of muscle, where you find them, and what distinguishes the difference between the three kinds of muscles. So pick that out of these slides, and then know some of this terminology. Be able to tell me what an antagonistic muscle is and give me an example of those. Be specific in your definitions or your comparison, and tell me what a flexor and an extensor are. Know a little bit about what skeletal muscles do for us to keep us warm, and then be able to talk to me about the organization of a skeletal muscle. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed this. Sorry for picking on you, Sophia, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.